Settle in, get comfortable, let your shoulders drop, let your jaw unclench, and just breathe for a second. Take a slow breath in through your nose, hold it for just a moment, and let it go. Let everything about today go with it. The emails, the conversations you replayed in your head, the things you meant to do and did not get around to, let all of it drift back in a way like sound moving through a closed window. Present but muffled. Present but no longer urgent. Tonight we are going somewhere warm and familiar. A little house on a cul-de-sac in a small fictional town in Rhode Island. A house that has seen more chaos than any home in the history of television. A house where a baby builds weapons in his crib. A dog writes failed novels at the kitchen table. And the father once got into a 6-minute fistfight with a giant chicken for absolutely no sane reason whatsoever. We are going to the Griffin house tonight, and we are going to spend some time going through all of those moments. Those glorious, unhinged, jaw-dropping, occasionally deeply uncomfortable moments where Family Guy looked at the line in the distance, kept walking past it, and then somehow managed to find another line even further out that it could also cross. This is going to be slow. It is going to be detailed. It is going to be thorough. We are going to sit with each story, each guy, each moment of absolute television chaos and really let it wash over us. No rushing, no skipping past the good stuff. Think of this like sitting with a very long, very comfortable book. The kind where you read the same paragraph twice, not because you missed anything the first time, but because you wanted to stay in the feeling a little longer. Let the day go. You have nothing to do right now except this. You have nothing to be right now except here. The house on Spooner Street has a light on, and there is a seat at the table. Section 1. The beginning of a beautiful, extremely strange relationship. Before we get to the jokes that went too far, you need to understand what made Family Guy the kind of show that could even attempt those jokes in the first place. Because the show did not start as a machine for shock value. It started as something genuinely clever, surprisingly warm, and deeply strange in a way that felt completely intentional. Family Guy was created by Seth MacFarlane, a guy who had studied at the Rhode Island School of Design and spent his early career working on animated shows at Hanna-Barbera. He worked on Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, Dexter's Laboratory. He was absorbing the language of animation. He was learning what made cartoons tick, what made characters memorable, what made a joke land in a way that stuck with people for years. Before the show ever existed as Family Guy, MacFarlane made 2 short animated films. The first was called The Life of Larry, and the second was Larry and Steve. These were rough, small, handmade little things featuring a guy named Larry and his dog, Steve. If you go back and watch them, you can see the clear ancestors of Peter and Brian Griffin. Larry was the lovable, not entirely brilliant everyman. Steve was the talking dog who was more intelligent and more self-aware than his owner. The dynamic was already there, baked in from the very beginning. MacFarlane took those characters, built a family around them, changed some names, added a 1-year-old supervillain and a British accent, and pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in May of 1998. Fox liked what they saw. The show premiered on January 31st, 1999, right after Super Bowl 33, which is one of the single best time slots in all of American television. Millions of people have been watching football all afternoon. They were comfortable on their couches. They were not going anywhere. And then this new animated show about a ridiculous working-class family appeared on their screen. That first episode pulled in around 22 million viewers, which was a staggering number. The town was called Quahog, Rhode Island. The family was the Griffins. You had Peter, the overweight, chronically unwise father, who worked at a toy factory, loved beer, and meant absolutely no harm to anyone ever, despite constantly causing it. You had Lois, his wife, the patient, piano-playing, quietly gorgeous mother who kept the whole operation from collapsing. You had Meg, the oldest daughter, 16 years old, just trying to be a normal teenage girl in a family that made normal completely impossible. You had Chris, the teenage son, soft-hearted and spacey. You had Stewie, the baby, 1-year-old, British accent, murder plots, weapons of mass destruction. And you had Brian, the dog, who walked on 2 legs and drank martinis and was often the smartest person in the room. What the early seasons understood, and what made them so genuinely good, was balance. Every character served a purpose. Peter was the source of the chaos. Lois was the anchor. Meg was the relatable outsider. Chris was the sweet absence of awareness. Stewie was the sublime incongruity, the monster in the playpen. Brian was the grounding wire, the voice that kept saying, "Yes, this is all insane, and here is why." The comedy worked because the show had heart underneath the absurdity. The Griffins were ridiculous people, but they loved each other. Episodes ended with apologies and hugs. Peter would do something catastrophically stupid, understand he had done something catastrophically stupid, and try to make it right. That cycle, the mess, the realization, the repair, is what made him likable even when he was being an idiot. You laughed at Peter Griffin in those early years because you had probably seen something like him in your own life. The harmless blunderer who means well and breaks things by accident. The cutaway gags existed from day one, but they were seasoning. Short, sharp, funny little detours that added flavor without replacing the main meal. A character would reference something, the screen would cut to a 20-second absurdist joke, and then cut right back to the story as if nothing had happened. They were bonuses. They were gifts. They were little comedic surprises that rewarded your attention without demanding it. The first 3 seasons of Family Guy are still, to this day, considered a genuine achievement in animated television. Season 1 averaged 12.8 million households. The writing was tight. The characters were consistent. The humor was dark in places, but always rooted in something true. This was a show that had found its voice on the very first try and understood exactly what it was doing. And then Fox canceled it. Twice. The cancellation story is one of the stranger tales in television history. During its second season, Fox moved Family Guy to Thursday nights, directly against Frasier on NBC, one of the most popular comedies on television. The ratings dropped. Fox moved it again to Tuesday nights, where it got beaten by Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Fox kept shuffling the show around, changing its time slot, giving it no stability, no chance to build a consistent audience. By the end of the third season in 2002, the show was officially canceled. But then something unexpected happened. Cartoon Network bought the reruns for their Adult Swim late-night block, getting the rights for almost nothing because nobody thought the show was worth much anymore. The reruns premiered on April 20th, 2003, and nearly overnight, Family Guy became the highest-rated show on the entire Adult Swim block. It boosted the block's viewership by 239%. At the same time, DVD sets for the first and second seasons came out and sold over 400,000 copies. A cult following had not just formed, it had exploded. Fox noticed. By 2004, they ordered new episodes. The show was coming back. A 4th season was set to air in 2005. Fans were thrilled beyond reason, the way you get thrilled when something you love comes back from the dead, which almost never happens in television. And this is where the story starts to get complicated. And this is where, eventually, we start to arrive at the jokes that went too far. Before we completely leave the golden years behind, it is worth lingering on a few of the most specific things the early show got right. because the precision of what it got right is directly connected to the precision of what later went wrong. It is not enough to say the early seasons were better. You have to understand what better means in this context, what specific qualities were present that made the show something genuinely worth caring about. The dialogue in seasons 1 through 3 had a rhythm to it that felt both scripted and natural at the same time. The characters spoke in the cadence of real people, not in the cadence of people who know they are delivering setups for jokes. When Lois and Peter had an argument, it sounded like people who knew each other well and loved each other imperfectly, not like a sitcom couple performing conflict for the benefit of an audience. When Brian and Peter talked at the bar, it sounded like two actual friends, one more intelligent than the other, navigating the space between them with genuine affection. The show also had a quality of specificity in its cultural references that is easy to overlook but was essential to how the comedy worked. The cutaways and jokes in the early seasons were not random. They referenced specific things, specific films, specific cultural moments, specific decades. Peter's obsessive love for things from the 1970s and 1980s was not just a character trait, it was a lens through which the humor was focused. The jokes came from somewhere identifiable. They had a perspective. You could feel the specific sensibility of the people who had written them, the things they cared about and found funny and wanted to share. That feeling of having been written by specific people with a specific point of view is one of the most fragile qualities any creative work can have. And it is one of the first things to go when a show expands its writer pool rapidly and loses the concentrated vision of its original creative engine. The early seasons also had what you might call comedic economy, the quality of not wasting anything. A good joke once told was not repeated. Characters did not return to the same well twice in the same episode because the writers trusted that the first trip to the well had served its purpose. The show moved. It trusted its audience to keep up without being dragged. Later seasons would discover that you could fill time by revisiting the same joke structure, by extending what should have been a 5-second gag to 30 or 40 seconds, by repeating the premise of a joke in slightly different phrasing, until what was originally funny was beaten flat by insistence. The early show trusted its audience. That trust is what made watching it feel respectful rather than exhausting. All right, the time for the golden years has passed, Sid. Now we walk into the territory where the show started testing the definitions of too far. And we start where the show always started when it wanted to go somewhere big. We start with Peter Griffin. And we start with a chicken. Hey, before we go any further into the madness, drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from right now and what time it is. I absolutely love reading where everyone is tuning in from. Whether you're in your bed at midnight, on the couch at 3 in the morning, or somehow watching this at a reasonable human hour, I want to know. And if you enjoy what we do here at Uncle Guy Lore, hitting that subscribe button is completely free and it means everything to keeping this going. All right, we are just getting warmed up. Section 2. The Giant Chicken Fights. When cartoon violence became an art form and then a warning sign. Let us start with the most immediately joyful category of Family Guy going too far, which is also, if you pay attention, one of the clearest windows into how the show's relationship with excess changed over the years. The Giant Chicken Fights. If you have never seen a Family Guy chicken fight, allow me to paint you a picture. You are watching an episode of the show. Peter Griffin is in the middle of some scene, having a conversation with Lois, or walking through town or doing something relatively ordinary. Then a giant chicken, roughly the same size as Peter, appears and challenges him to combat. And then for anywhere from 2 to 6 solid, uninterrupted minutes, Peter Griffin and this giant chicken destroy everything in their path while fighting each other to an apparent death. After which Peter walks away covered in damage, picks up whatever conversation he was having before as if absolutely nothing happened, and the chicken is left for dead in the wreckage until, in the final seconds of the scene, one enormous eye opens and makes clear that the chicken is not, in fact, dead. The feud between Peter Griffin and Ernie the Giant Chicken is one of the most elaborate and lovingly crafted running jokes in the history of animated television. And it started with something so small it borders on the philosophically perfect: an expired coupon. According to the show's internal mythology, Ernie once gave Peter a coupon that had already passed its expiration date. Peter used it anyway, was rejected, and was so incensed by this that he attacked the chicken in the middle of the street. The feud was born. Two massive, proud individuals locked in eternal combat over a coupon that probably would have saved Peter about 70 cents. The first chicken fight appeared in the episode Da Boom, which aired in the second season. It lasted around 2 minutes and was already something special. Peter and the chicken threw each other through windows, crashed cars, demolished storefronts. There was something almost cinematic about the choreography, a genuine parody of action movie fighting sequences, done in an animated sitcom with complete commitment and zero irony. It was the show saying, yes, we know this is absurd, and we are going to give you the most magnificent absurdity we can manage. The fight ended with Peter slamming the chicken's head into a photocopier over and over with the dedication of a man who genuinely believes in what he is doing. Then they both fell off a building. Peter landed on the chicken. Peter got up and walked away. A single eye opened. And then the show came back from cancellation, and the chicken fights came back with it, and something extraordinary happened. They got better. Not just bigger. Though they got bigger, they got more elaborate, more cinematic, more technically accomplished. The second fight pulled off a sequence that referenced the Nazi mechanic fight from Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, ending with the chicken getting hit by a helicopter blade in a moment so committed to its own comedic violence that it felt almost like affection. By the third fight in the season 5 episode No Chris Left Behind, the show introduced a storyline between the fights where Peter and Ernie actually briefly stopped fighting, teamed up to fight an alligator together, and then had dinner with Ernie's wife Nicole. They realized mid-fight that they could not even remember what they had originally been fighting about. They sat at a restaurant together, these two mortal enemies breaking bread. It was going to be fine. These two crazy guys were going to be all right. Then they got into an argument about who would pay the check. The fight immediately resumed and escalated into a sequence involving every cooking implement in the restaurant kitchen. The moment where the feud nearly ended and the reason it could not end is a tiny, compressed masterpiece of comedy writing. You laughed at the fight, but you laughed even harder at the check argument because it captured something true. Sometimes the thing that keeps a feud alive is not the original grievance. It is pride and money and ego and not being willing to be the one who gives in. The fourth fight, which appeared in the episode Internal Affairs in Season 9, took things further still. The animation was more fluid. The set pieces were larger. The property damage was staggering. There was a moment where the two of them ended up on a moving train, fighting at high speed while landscape flew past behind them. There was a moment on a small plane. There was a feint toward reconciliation, because by this point, the reconciliation attempt had become its own genre convention within the joke. But the fifth fight, which appeared in the episode Back to the Pilot and clocked in at just under 6 minutes, is the one that gets the most reverence. 6 minutes is a long time for a fight sequence in a comedy. 6 minutes during which the show traveled through time, visited a cloning lab, went into outer space, and had Peter and the chicken fighting in zero gravity while stars drifted past them both. They ended up on an oil rig. Peter won. The chicken apparently died. The eye did not open this time. Except it did, later. The chicken kept coming back. Because the chicken always keeps coming back. What makes the chicken fights interesting as a window into the show's relationship with going too far is the shift in what they represent at different points in the series. In the early seasons, the fights were parody. They were the show's way of winking at action cinema, taking the genre of the epic battle sequence and showing you what it looks like when the combatants are a middle-aged father and a very large bird arguing over a coupon. The humor came from the commitment and the incongruity. In the later seasons, the fights became something slightly different. They became a kind of safety valve for the show, a guaranteed crowd pleaser that would always land because the formula was known and beloved. They were no longer a surprise. They were a tradition. And traditions can be wonderful things, but they are not the same as genuine creative invention. The fifth fight's 6-minute runtime is a good example of the shift. In the early days, a long fight sequence worked because you did not see it coming. By the fifth iteration, the length was almost obligatory, an escalation for its own sake. The chicken fights also represent something broader about how Family Guy handled cartoon violence over the course of its run. In the beginning, violence was absurdist. Characters got hurt in ways that were clearly impossible and clearly harmless, because that is the language of classic animation. The rules of the cartoon universe allowed for Tom and Jerry logic, where you can be flattened by a steamroller and pop right back up. That logic is comedy-safe violence. It signposts itself as unreal. As the show progressed, the violence in the non-chicken fight episodes got more graphic, more detailed, more pointed toward realistic injury. The show started depicting wounds with a level of biological specificity that felt different in nature from cartoon slapstick. It crossed from the Looney Tunes tradition into something that sat uncomfortably between animation and body horror. The chicken fights held on to the original logic, the impossible violence that nobody takes seriously. But the rest of the show's violence was moving somewhere else. The chicken fights also eventually got their conclusion. In the episode The Chicken or the Meg, showrunner Alex Sulkin decided that Ernie the Giant Chicken had run his course and it was time to end the character. Ernie was permanently killed, which meant the show was closing a door on one of the purest sources of joy it had ever produced. The eternal, ridiculous feud was over. No more expired coupon. No more eye-opening in the rubble. It is possible to feel nostalgic for an animated fight between a man and a giant chicken, and the fact that you can feels like a small miracle. There is something worth noting about the cultural life of the chicken fights outside of the show itself. When Family Guy reruns began airing on Adult Swim in 2003, the clips that circulated most widely on early video sharing platforms were not the heartfelt moments or the sharpest political jokes. They were the chicken fights. People clipped them. People shared them. They spread on Kazaa and BearShare and the early internet in a way that genuinely contributed to the show's revival. There is an argument to be made, not a small one, that the chicken fights helped bring Family Guy back from the dead. The reason they worked so well as viral content is precisely the reason they worked so well as television. They were complete in themselves. You did not need context. You did not need to know who Peter Griffin was or what his relationship to this chicken was. You just needed to watch a man and a giant bird fall off a building together, and the commitment and the craft and the pure, joyful ridiculousness of it were immediately comprehensible. Comedy has always traveled faster than drama, and absurdist comedy travels faster than most. The fights also modeled something about how Family Guy thought about quality. When the show put effort into something, really put effort in, the results were undeniable. The chicken fights were meticulously choreographed. They were animated with care that went well beyond what was technically required for a recurring gag in a comedy show. They were scored with music that played them straight, dramatic compositions that treated the fights as genuinely epic even while the comedy was obviously present. That gap between the seriousness of the presentation and the absurdity of the content was exactly the same gap that made early Stewie work. The same gap that made the best early cutaways work. Commitment plus incongruity applied with craft. Section 3. The Meg situation. Years of something that is hard to call comedy. This section is going to need a gentle approach because what happened to Meg Griffin over the course of Family Guy is not a simple story about a joke going too far. It is a story about a joke replacing a person. It is a story about a creative decision that started small and grew into something that said things about the show that the show did not seem to be aware it was saying. Let us start at the beginning, when Meg Griffin was just a girl. In the first season, voiced by Lacey Chabert, and then from season 2 onward by Mila Kunis, Meg was 16 years old and attending James Woods Regional High School. She was unpopular. She was ordinary. She was not as loud as her father or as calculating as her baby brother or as witty as the family dog. She was the quiet one in a family built on noise, the normal one in a family built on the abnormal. And that contrast was the joke. Meg was the straight-faced audience surrogate in a universe of chaos. She was the character who looked around at all of this and felt exactly what any sensible person would feel, which was a mixture of exhaustion and longing for things to be different. In those first 3 seasons, Meg's struggles were specific and grounded. She wanted to fit in at school and could not quite manage it. She wanted her parents to notice her, and sometimes they were too distracted by the latest disaster. She had crushes on boys who did not return the feeling. She was awkward and earnest and trying, which is the exact description of being a teenager for a large percentage of people who ever went through it. The jokes about Meg in those early seasons were the kind of jokes that came from recognition. This is what it feels like to want things you cannot have. This is what it feels like to be the least remarkable person in any room you walk into, even when that room is your own home. The show began to shift its treatment of Meg around season 4, when the jokes changed from her being boring and unpopular to her being ugly and unwanted. The distinction is more important than it might initially seem. Being boring is a characterization that leaves the door open for change. Theoretically, a boring character can become interesting. Being ugly, within the logic of the show's cruelty, was treated as a fixed and permanent state that justified treatment no other character received. Other characters started recoiling from Meg in disgust. They would make gagging sounds when she entered a room. Peter began making jokes about her appearance with a frequency and a venom that escalated season by season. What started as occasional insensitivity, the kind of offhanded cruelty that an inattentive father might let slip without fully meaning it, became deliberate, calculated, sustained. By seasons 8 through 14, the treatment of Meg Griffin had become one of the show's defining features. Peter would use his daughter as a source of what the show treated as entertainment. He would pass gas in her face. He would physically shove her. He would make comments delivered to the camera as much as to other characters about wishing she did not exist. There was a flashback episode in which it was revealed that Peter and Lois attempted to abandon Meg at a fire station when she was still a baby, leaving her there before being persuaded to take her back. This was presented as a joke. The laughter was supposed to land on the image of parents casually trying to dispose of their infant daughter. In another episode, Peter went undercover at Meg's high school and chose popularity over his own child, ditching her to hang out with kids who were cool enough to make him feel good. He chose strangers who liked him over his daughter who loved him. And the show played this not as a devastating portrait of parental failure, but as a situation comedy. The physical escalation was matched by an expansion of who was participating. It was not just Peter. The entire Griffin household eventually united in a shared project of treating Meg as though she deserved what was happening to her. Lois, who in the early seasons was the warm, steady center of the family, began joining in with her own brand of cold contempt. Chris, who used to have a normal sibling relationship with Meg, started throwing insults along with everyone else. Even Stewie, who in the original seasons barely interacted with her, started punctuating scenes with casual cruelty directed her way. The message the show was broadcasting, whether it intended to or not, was that Meg Griffin's suffering was inherently funny because Meg Griffin was inherently unworthy of anything better. And the accumulation of that message over dozens and dozens of episodes across years and years of television created something that moved beyond dark comedy into a territory that was harder to define and harder to sit with. The episode that brought all of this to a head was called Seahorse Seashell Party from season 10. The Griffin family was stuck inside during a hurricane. Brian, in a subplot, was on a hallucinogenic mushroom trip that gave the episode some surreal energy. And then Meg snapped. She turned to her family and delivered a speech that was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most honest moments the show had ever produced. She told Peter he was selfish and irresponsible. She told him he had no education and no interests and just did whatever reckless thing occurred to him without thinking about anyone else. She told him he was a terrible father. She told him that if someone on the outside could see how he treated her, he would be in prison. She told Lois that she chose a man-child to start a family with, knew it going in, and then used Meg as an emotional punching bag to deal with the consequence. Fans who had been watching Meg get destroyed for seasons leaned forward. This was it. This was the show accounting for what it had done. This was Meg finally speaking the truth. And then came the ending. After Meg's outburst, the family started falling apart. Without a shared target, Peter, Lois, Chris, and Brian turned their frustrations on each other. The family dynamic broke down, and in the final act, Meg went to Brian, took back everything she had said, and returned to her role as the person everyone hurt. The episode explained it explicitly. Meg was the pressure release valve. Without her absorbing the family's cruelty, the family would destroy itself. She chose to go back to being the punching bag because it was the only way to keep things stable. The intended reading was that this was Meg's sacrifice, her love for her family expressed through self-abnegation. The reading that a large portion of the audience took away was something else, that victims of sustained abuse should accept their role because their suffering keeps other people comfortable. That standing up for yourself is selfish when it disrupts the people who are hurting you. That the correct response to years of mistreatment is to quietly walk back to the person doing it and let them keep going. Mila Kunis, who voiced Meg for the entirety of the show's run after season 2, has spoken publicly about the real-world impact of the character's treatment. People would approach her and say Peter's dismissive catchphrase at her, the one he directed at Meg. The fictional cruelty had been absorbed by the culture and was being redirected at the real woman who gave the character her voice. To the show's credit, the treatment of Meg did eventually begin to shift. Around seasons 14 and 15, the most extreme abuse started tapering off. Partly this has been credited to the addition of more women to the writing staff, who pushed back against the relentless cruelty. By the later seasons, Meg started getting episodes where she was competent and even cool. She started fighting back against bullies. She showed resilience that the previous decade had never allowed her to express, but the damage had been done across roughly 10 seasons. And what makes it especially frustrating is that the show proved repeatedly that it knew how to write Meg as a real character. There was a season 13 episode where Meg met Lisa Simpson during a crossover event, and Lisa encouraged her, told her she mattered, helped her discover a talent for the saxophone. It was warm and thoughtful and showed exactly what Meg could be when someone cared enough to write her as a person. There was a season 14 episode called Peter's Sister, where the show tried to explain Peter's abuse of Meg by revealing that his own sister had physically and emotionally abused him growing up, that he was passing down a cycle of pain he had never processed. Meg learned this and showed him compassion. Peter acknowledged, in a rare moment of something approaching self-awareness, that he had been terrible to her. They reconciled. It was genuinely moving. And then the very next episode reset everything, as if the reconciliation had never happened. That is what made the Meg situation so specifically sad. The show was capable of doing better. It proved it. It just kept choosing not to. The irony of Meg Griffin's situation in the show is one that the writers may have eventually understood, but never quite resolved. She is, by any reasonable measure, the most sympathetic character the show has. She wants normal things. She wants to be loved. She wants her family to be proud of her. She wants to have friends who genuinely care about her. She wants to belong somewhere, to feel like her presence matters. These are not extraordinary desires. They are the most basic desires that any person can have. The show spent roughly 10 seasons punishing her for having them. The real-world impact of this extended beyond the television screen. When Mila Kunis has spoken about the experience of voicing Meg, she has described a specific kind of cultural residue that attached itself to her from the role. The catchphrase Peter directed dismissively at Meg became something people said to Kunis in public, at events, in the street. The fictional cruelty had been absorbed by the audience and was being replayed at the real person who gave the character her voice. That is not a metaphor for the show's influence. It is a documented thing that happened to a real woman as a direct consequence of a sustained creative choice. The larger question the Meg situation raises about Family Guy is what the show thought it was doing, because there is a version of an abused character that functions as genuine social commentary. There are stories told through the lens of a character's suffering that illuminate something true about how certain people are treated in the world and why. Those stories can be dark and uncomfortable and still meaningful. Meg's story did not quite function that way, at least not consistently. The show was not using her suffering to say something. It was using her suffering as the content. The suffering was the entertainment rather than the vehicle for something worth examining. This pattern, the meaningful gesture followed by the reset, is perhaps the single most consistent feature of the show's relationship with its own darkness. It could see clearly. It could articulate clearly. And then it would put the clarity away and carry on as it had before. Again and again and again. The fact that the treatment of Meg did eventually improve, that the later seasons gave her a different kind of story, is genuinely worth acknowledging. The show changed. The writing changed. Meg Griffin in season 22 is a recognizably different character from Meg Griffin in season 10. She has survived what was done to her. She has come out the other side. If that is not exactly the arc the show intended to give her, it is at least an arc, which is more than she had for a long time. And in the quiet space between the Meg story and the Brian story, it is worth pausing for just a moment and noticing what they have in common. Both characters were handled thoughtlessly for long stretches of the show's run. Both characters had specific qualities that were buried under the choices the writers made about how to use them. Both characters had moments late in the series where the show remembered what they were actually capable of and used that capability for something real. And in both cases, those late moments of getting it right were tinged with something that was almost nostalgia, the feeling of being reminded of what you had before you lost it. The show's relationship with its characters is, in the end, the show's relationship with its own history. Every season added something to the record. Every choice accumulated. The characters who were treated well became characters people loved and followed across decades. The characters who were treated poorly became cautionary tales that are still being referenced in conversations about what animated television should and should not do. Both of those outcomes lived in the same show at the same time for 25 years. That is the full picture. And now we move to the character whose decline is the most painful of all, because he started the highest. Section 4. Brian Griffin's long walk off the edge of a cliff. If the Meg situation was the show doing something harmful without appearing to fully understand that it was doing something harmful, the decline of Brian Griffin was the show doing something harmful with complete awareness and a kind of bewildered commitment to continuing anyway. Brian Griffin started as the soul of the show, not a supporting character, not the funny sidekick. The soul, the grounding wire, the character whose presence made everything around him make more sense because he was the one looking at all of it with clear eyes and saying, "Yes, I see this. And here is what I think about it." In the early seasons, Brian was smart in a way that felt real. Not smart in the way that a character is labeled smart because the writers need someone to explain the plot. Smart in the way that someone who has read widely, thought carefully, and developed an actual point of view about the world is smart. He had opinions, he had aesthetics, he had a slightly too high opinion of his own capabilities, which was itself a specific and recognizable human trait. He wanted to be taken seriously as a writer. He had been working on a novel for years without finishing it, which is one of the most precisely observed details in the entire show. This dog with literary ambitions and a blank page. He drank a little too much. He had complicated feelings for Lois that he kept mostly buried. He was unlucky in love in ways that felt earned and sympathetic. All of these qualities made Brian feel like a person you might know. The failure, the ambition, the drinking, the unrequited feeling, the dry wit deployed as armor. He was the character who made you think, I know this guy. I might even be this guy sometimes. The first crack appeared after the show's 2005 revival, when Brian's political views began expanding from one characteristic among many into the primary lens through which the writers were using him. Brian had always been liberal and atheist and opinionated about social issues. But in the original run, these were notes in a chord. After the revival, they started becoming the whole song. Entire scenes were devoted to Brian delivering speeches about whatever social or political issue the writers wanted to address that week. He stopped feeling like a character who happened to have views and started feeling like a vehicle the writers were operating, pointed at the audience for the purpose of issuing positions on things. Even viewers who agreed with every single position Brian expressed found it grating, because the problem was not the content of the views. The problem was that a character had been transformed into a mouthpiece, and that transformation made him less real, less interesting, less worth caring about. But the political soapboxing was still recoverable. What happened next was not. The Brian of the later seasons became someone who was not just flawed, but genuinely unkind. The specific combination of traits the show gave him, the pretension paired with actual mediocrity, the claimed sensitivity paired with actual selfishness, was applied so heavily that Brian began to feel less like a flawed person and more like a case study in a particular species of person. The person who talks endlessly about being thoughtful and deep while demonstrably behaving in ways that are shallow and cruel. The episode that crystallized this for a large portion of the fan base was Brian Wright's A Bestseller from season 9. In this episode, Stewie encouraged Brian to get back to writing, offered genuine support and genuine belief in his friend's talents, and Brian responded by writing a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It that became a massive commercial success. This should have been a warm story about a character finally achieving something he had always wanted, with gratitude toward the friend who helped make it happen. Instead, the episode showed Brian becoming monstrous with success. He treated Stewie, the person who had believed in him, with contempt. He looked down at him, dismissed him, acted as though Stewie was beneath him now that Brian had achieved something. The episode showed in compressed and vivid detail exactly what kind of person Brian had become. Someone who needed validation so badly that when he finally received it, his first impulse was to use it as a weapon against the people who had helped him get there. The infamous speech in the season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black, where Glenn Quagmire tells Brian exactly why he despises him, is worth dwelling on because of how precisely it itemizes the character's collapse. Quagmire calls Brian out for constantly hitting on his best friend's wife. He calls him out for living rent-free in the Griffin household, eating their food, never paying, always promising to get people back later, while later never comes. He calls him out for pretending to be a deep intellectual who loves women for their souls while dating nothing but shallow, attractive women he loses interest in immediately. He calls him out for his failed writing career. He calls him out for abandoning his own son. What the show clearly intended was for this speech to be a cathartic moment where the audience, which had been growing increasingly frustrated with Brian's behavior, could hear their frustrations validated. The problem is that after that speech, nothing changed. Brian did not grow, he did not adjust. He did not take the honest assessment of his character and do anything with it. He got worse. His behavior in the seasons following Quagmire's speech escalated rather than corrected. The feud between them became its own recurring source of cruelty, with Brian doing things like accepting Quagmire's kindness in paying for a dental operation, and then immediately using his new teeth to smile while he swindled Quagmire into buying a terrible property. There was an episode where Brian found a woman trapped in a car about to fall into the ocean. He started to rescue her. Then he found out she had a child, which meant she was probably married and therefore unavailable to date. He let go of the car. He let a woman and her child fall into the water and drown, because she was not a potential romantic prospect. That is not dark humor. That is a character who has been written into the territory of actual villainy. The show presented it as a comedic moment. The laughter it was designed to generate would have required finding it funny that a character let two people die because they could not be used for sex. That is a very specific kind of funny that is not separated from cruelty by very much. There was an episode where Brian, drunk, completely destroyed Stewie's beloved teddy bear Rupert, chewing it to pieces because he was tired of Stewie treating it like a real person. Rupert, for context, was the most emotionally significant object in Stewie's life. The bear that he spoke to, confided in, the soft, constant presence in his corner. Brian knew this. He destroyed it anyway. And then the show asked you to laugh. There was an episode where Brian gave herpes to both Chris and Stewie. Stewie is a baby. The writers seemed aware at intervals that they were writing Brian into a very strange place. There were episodes scattered throughout the later seasons where Brian behaved like the character he used to be, showing care for Stewie, offering genuine warmth, doing something selfless and kind. These moments proved the writers had not forgotten who Brian was. They remembered. They just kept choosing to ignore it most of the time. and then came the death. In the season 12 episode Life of Brian, which aired on November 24th, 2013, Brian Griffin was hit by an out-of-control car while the family was playing street hockey in the street. His injuries were fatal. He said goodbye to the family in the hospital. He expressed his love for them. And then he died. The reaction from the audience was, by almost any measure, extraordinary. Within hours of the episode airing, a petition appeared on change.org calling for Brian's resurrection, directed at Seth MacFarlane and Fox. Within 72 hours, it had over 100,000 signatures. The hashtag #BringBackBrian trended on Twitter. Memorial tattoos appeared. National news outlets covered the death of a cartoon dog with the seriousness typically reserved for different kinds of stories. People who had been frustrated with Brian for years found that when it came to actually losing him, the frustration evaporated and only the grief remained. Seth MacFarlane himself said later that the size of the reaction surprised everyone involved. He framed it charitably as evidence that people still cared deeply about the character. The episode received a 2.2 out of 5 rating from viewers and was watched by 4.58 million people. Just 2 episodes later, in the season 12 Christmas episode called Christmas Guy, Stewie used time travel to go back and prevent Brian from being hit by the car. Brian came back. Everything returned to normal. The replacement dog, Vinny, was largely forgotten. The death was undone. The grief was rendered retroactively pointless. Many fans found this deeply unsatisfying, not because they wanted Brian to stay dead, but because the reversal confirmed what the cynics had suspected from the moment the death aired. It was a stunt. It was a ratings mechanism. It was the show exploiting the emotional attachment people still had to Brian to generate the biggest possible news cycle, with no intention of following through on the story implications. MacFarlane actually tweeted after Brian's return, asking if people really thought they would kill off Brian, with a tone of incredulous amusement at how many people had fallen for it. Some people found that funny. A large number found it insulting. After his return, Brian somehow became harder to defend. The character who came back was, if anything, more extreme in his worst qualities. More selfish, more pretentious, more oblivious to the gap between who he believed himself to be and what the evidence of his behavior actually showed. Brian Griffin's journey from the most grounded and sympathetic character on the show to one of the most frequently cited examples of why the show went wrong is, when you trace it carefully, and one of the most instructive stories in the history of television character mismanagement. It is a masterclass in what happens when you take a character with specific, lovable complexity and then slowly replace that complexity with a single-note amplification of their worst quality until the note is so loud it drowns everything else out. Section 5. Stewie Griffin, the monster we lost. There is a version of this story that has a happy ending, and depending on who you ask, the later version of Stewie Griffin is the happy ending. A character who started as a cold-blooded villain with plans for world domination grew into someone capable of genuine warmth, real friendship, and emotional depth that the original version could never have expressed. That reading is not wrong. It is just incomplete. Because the original Stewie Griffin was something genuinely irreplaceable, and what replaced him, however warm and sometimes brilliant, is not quite the same kind of thing. Stewie Griffin was introduced in the very first episode of Family Guy as a 1-year-old baby who spoke with a refined British accent and wanted to kill his mother. That sentence, read back carefully, contains more creative voltage than most entire television characters. There is a reason it became iconic so quickly. There is nothing else like it. The specificity of the British accent, the precision of the world domination ambitions, the absolute normalcy of the setting, the high chair, the sippy cup, the stuffed bear, against which these ambitions played out. Seth MacFarlane has described Stewie as, in essence, an evil Rex Harrison. That description is perfect. It captures both the specific quality of the voice and the specific quality of the menace, which was always elegant, always articulate, always delivered with the cadence of someone who had thought very carefully about what they were saying and concluded that it was correct. Stewie was not a raving villain. He was a precise one. He did not shout about his plans. He outlined them step by calculated step with the confidence of someone who expected to succeed. In Season 1, Stewie was dangerous, not in a way that ever quite broke through into genuine threat, because the show maintained the right level of comic distance, but in a way that carried a low hum of menace through every scene he was in. He built ray guns in his bedroom. He constructed mind control devices. He designed machines capable of altering the weather. He plotted against his mother with the strategic thoroughness of someone who had read extensively on the subject of assassination and taken detailed notes. In the Season 1 episode, Chitty Chitty Death Bang, it was revealed that Stewie had been planning his escape from the womb from the moment of conception, that the doctor who delivered him had found a map of Europe inside Lois, with plans to bomb major capitals, drawn by a one-day-old baby in the process of being born. The show presented this information with complete deadpan. Nobody found this remarkable. The doctor mentioned it. Life continued. Stewie was already ahead of everyone. The comedy came entirely from contrast. Here was a being in a diaper, sitting in a high chair, eating strained peas with a small spoon, who was also developing the specific logistics of how to poison the town's water supply. The gap between the container and the content was the joke, and the show found endless creative ways to deepen that gap. Stewie would deliver a 5-minute monologue about his plans for world domination in the exact cadence and vocabulary of a Bond villain. And then Lois would walk by, coo at him, and ask if he wanted more applesauce. The communication rule was one of the show's most effective ongoing structural devices. Most of the other characters could not hear Stewie or interpreted his speech as baby babble. Only Brian consistently understood him and could hold a genuine conversation with him. This meant that Stewie existed in a special kind of isolation within the world of the show, surrounded by people who could not perceive what he was, understood only by a dog who indulged him out of a mixture of amusement and genuine affection. The loneliness of the misunderstood genius compressed into the body of an infant in a yellow onesie was the engine of the character. The obsession with killing Lois was the most consistent running thread in those early seasons. Nearly every episode had at least one moment where Stewie either attempted to harm her, narrowly failed, or spent quiet time refining his approach for next time. The humor was not in the violence itself, but in the gap between Stewie's colossal ambition and his total inability across many seasons to actually accomplish anything. He was the most elaborately overqualified failure in the history of fiction. Brian was one of the only characters who could actually understand and engage with Stewie, which is why their friendship became so central to the show's best moments. But in the early seasons, the friendship was secondary to the villainy. Brian understood Stewie. He was not running the Stewie show. The first significant signal that the character was being redirected came in Season 2, where small moments of softness and vulnerability began appearing. Quick jokes that hinted at a different side of the personality, a worry about whether his diaper made him look a certain way, a moment of genuine childlike excitement about something that had nothing to do with world domination. These were minor touches, easy to read as just texture, variety in the portrayal of an extreme character. By Season 3, the softer elements were getting more screen time. By season 4 after the revival, the decision had been made. The writers and McFarlane had concluded that the evil genius baby concept had run its course, that there were no new angles to explore, that the joke had been taken as far as it could go. They started steering Stewie toward a new identity centered on his friendship with Brian and his emotional and personal development. The season 6 two-parter Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie is widely understood as the unofficial farewell ceremony for the original version of the character, and it is worth dwelling on because it is, in many ways, one of the finest things the show ever did. The setup was elegant. Brian challenged Stewie on the fact that he had been threatening to kill Lois for years without ever actually following through. Brian pointed out that every plan had failed, every attempt had been interrupted, that Stewie was all talk. And Stewie, furious, decided to prove him wrong. He acquired a machine gun. He traveled to the cruise ship where Peter and Lois were celebrating her birthday. He found his mother on the deck. She was astonished to see him. He pulled out the gun. The screen slowed down. There was a moment of genuine tension that the show had not quite achieved before with Stewie. And then he opened fire. Lois's chest was riddled with bullets. She fell overboard. Her body sank into the ocean. The episode that followed, Lois Kills Stewie, showed what happened next. Stewie had finally gotten what he wanted. Lois was apparently dead. Peter was accused of murder. And Stewie, freed from his primary obsession, moved directly to his secondary one, world domination. He seized the CIA. He overthrew the United States government. He became the dictator he had always intended to become. In these episodes, the show gave the audience everything they had been waiting to see from Stewie since the very first episode. The plans came true. The villain won. It was darkly, thrillingly satisfying. The voice cast was brilliant. The plotting was tight. It was the show at peak confidence doing something genuinely bold. And then the simulation reveal happened. All of it, from the moment Peter and Lois left on the cruise, had been a computer simulation Stewie was running to see what would happen if he actually followed through. None of it was real. Nobody died. The world domination was hypothetical. Everything reset to normal. The creative logic of the twist is understandable. The show had to continue. You cannot actually kill Lois Griffin, not in a way that sticks. The simulation ending allowed the show to give the audience the dark catharsis of seeing Stewie succeed, while also keeping the status quo intact for the following week. But the choice to tell that, choice to story as a simulation, also meant something that the writers may not have fully intended. It meant that the show was acknowledging with complete clarity that the original version of Stewie, the one with the plans and the ambition and the genuine menace, could only exist in a hypothetical space. He could not exist in the real fabric of the show's ongoing story. He was too extreme for the world the show had built around him. He had to be contained in a dream. After those episodes, the evil genius plots became increasingly rare. The attempts on Lois faded. The weapons and machines and elaborate schemes that had defined the character for 3 seasons became props that showed up occasionally for nostalgic effect rather than as genuine story drivers. Stewie became primarily the show's emotional register, the character through whom the show processed feeling. His storylines became about identity, about friendship, about jealousy and love, and the difficulty of being different in ways you do not fully understand. His relationship with Brian became the core of his characterization. None of this was bad writing. Some of the Stewie and Brian episodes from the middle seasons are genuinely beautiful. The episode Brian and Stewie, which will get its own dedicated treatment later in the script, is one of the most emotionally honest 30 minutes the show ever produced. There were road to episodes, the show's signature adventure format where the duo traveled somewhere together. that were inventive and funny and moved with a kind of joy that felt earned. But the creative trade was significant. You can count on two hands the number of animated characters who are insecure and searching for identity and capable of warm friendship. You cannot count any other character who is an evil genius baby with a British accent who had mapped every possible assassination route available to a 1-year-old. The argument that the evil baby concept had been exhausted does not quite land when you consider how many more seasons the show produced with the softer Stewie. If there was enough material to sustain 15 seasons with the gentler version, it is hard to accept that there was no more material available for one of the most original character concepts in animation history. The evil genius baby was not a one-note joke. It was a framework that could support countless variations, new inventions, new targets, new allies, new schemes with higher stakes and broader implications. The writers walked away from it not because it was finished, but because they were tired of it, which is a different thing entirely. What remains is a Stewie who is often funny and occasionally brilliant and sometimes deeply touching. But he is not dangerous anymore. He is not unpredictable. The charge has been discharged. Every scene he is in carries the memory of what he used to be, which casts a soft shadow over who he currently is. The most original villain in the history of animated television retired himself, and the show gave him a warm send-off and then kept going for 20 more seasons. And somewhere in there, something irreplaceable got quietly folded up and put away. The later seasons did occasionally reach back toward early Stewie as a kind of nostalgia gesture. There would be an episode where Stewie picked up a weapon that felt like the old weapons. A moment where the menace briefly surfaced through the warmth. An episode where someone suggested Stewie was getting soft, and he reacted with something close to the original darkness. These moments were received by fans as bright sparks in the middle of seasons that otherwise kept the gentler version center stage. They were appreciated precisely because they were rare. The most interesting thing about Stewie's arc, the full arc from evil genius to complex emotional being, is that it actually maps onto a real developmental truth. Children do become less extreme as they grow. The violence and grandiosity of early childhood, the stage when kids genuinely believe they are the most important beings in the universe and feel rage at not being treated accordingly, does soften. It becomes socialized. It becomes internalized. What starts as loud outward aggression turns into quieter internal complexity. In some ways, what happened to Stewie over 20-plus seasons is exactly what happens to people over 20-plus years of being alive. Whether the show intended that reading is impossible to know, but it is there if you want it. The evil baby grew up. He did not grow up well, or completely, or into anyone particularly functional, but he grew up. And growing up cost him the thing that made him legendary. Section 6. Peter Griffin's slow transformation into someone you do not want to know. The word that gets used for what happened to Peter Griffin is Flanderization, a term borrowed from the Simpsons character Ned Flanders, who started as a fully rounded religious neighbor and slowly had every aspect of his personality collapsed into a single exaggerated trait. Ned Flanders became just religious. Everything else about him was subordinated or eliminated until the character was a single note played on an instrument that used to have many strings. Family Guy is perhaps the most comprehensive example of this process in the history of animated television, and Peter Griffin is the most complete victim of it. In seasons 1 through 3, Peter was not a complicated person. He was not meant to be. He was a working-class father in his 40s, somewhat overweight, not academically gifted, employed at a toy factory called the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, before transitioning to work at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. He loved beer, He loved television, especially things from the 1970s and 1980s. He made bad decisions constantly and consistently. He got into situations that escalated past any reasonable person's ability to control. What made him work, what made him genuinely lovable despite all of this, was that underneath the incompetence there was affection. He loved Lois. It was not a complicated love. It was not a sophisticated love. It was the love of a man who was not sure how he had ended up with someone so much better than him and wanted to hold on to it. He loved his kids even when he was failing them. When he messed up, which was every episode, he felt it. He wanted to fix it. The fix was usually clumsy and sometimes made things worse, but the desire to fix things was real. That desire, the impulse toward repair, is what made Peter something other than just a disaster to observe from a safe distance. It made him a disaster that you were rooting for. You wanted the repair to happen. You got satisfaction when it did. The show was structured to deliver that satisfaction, and the delivery was reliable. Starting around season 5 and becoming unmistakable by season 8, the repair mechanism began to break down. The desire to fix things was replaced, gradually and then comprehensively, by an absence of any apparent desire to fix anything. Peter's stupidity scaled past the point where it felt like the stupidity of someone who does not think carefully, and into the territory of someone who does not think at all. His actions became not just thoughtless, but actively cruel in ways that the show no longer seemed interested in addressing. In the episode Baby It's Cold Inside, Peter and Lois are on a boat when Peter sees what he believes to be a shark approaching. His immediate response is to push Lois underwater and flee in the boat. He shoves his wife's body into the path of what he believes is a shark and then abandons her. The shark turns out to be a dolphin, which is meant to diffuse the moment comedically. But a moment where a man instinctively sacrifices his wife to a predator so that he can escape does not diffuse cleanly. It lingers. Early Peter would not have done this. Early Peter might have done something stupid to try to protect Lois. He might have fallen off the boat. He might have grabbed the wrong thing and made the situation worse. But his first impulse in the direction of danger would have been toward Lois, not away from her. In Muscle, Peter steals Halloween candy from Stewie, from his own baby. A grown adult man sitting in a corner of the house eating his infant son's Halloween candy is the kind of thing that functions as dark comedy when it is an occasional indulgence of the character's childish streak. When it is part of a larger portrait of a man who genuinely does not care about anyone in his family, it stops being funny in the same clean way. The episode The Seahorse Seashell Party, which we discussed in the Meg section, contains Meg's accurate and devastating speech about Peter's behavior. She calls him completely selfish. She calls him totally irresponsible. She describes specific things he has done to her, including farting in her face, which had by that point appeared in multiple episodes as a running source of humor. She says that if someone from outside their home could see how he treated her, he would be in prison. Peter's response to this is to laugh. Not nervously, not uncomfortably, with genuine amusement. He finds it entertaining that his daughter is telling him he has been a terrible father. He has no flicker of the guilt or sorrow or defensiveness that a recognizably human person would have in that moment. He laughs because it is funny to him. And in that single response, the character's transformation is complete. The Peter who used to feel bad when he hurt people, who would try to fix things even when he did not know how, was completely gone. What was left was a figure who experienced other people's pain as entertainment. His relationships with his friends followed a similar trajectory. In the early seasons, Peter's friendships with Joe Swanson, Cleveland Brown, and Glenn Quagmire were warm. They had each other's backs. They were the kind of friends who would do something stupid together and then deal with the consequences together. Their time at the bar together felt like a genuine pleasure they all took in each other's company. As the seasons went on, those friendships became performances of friendship over the architecture of something increasingly hollow. Peter would do genuinely terrible things to Joe, to Cleveland, to Quagmire, and face no real reckoning. In the episode Internal Affairs, Peter effectively tried to convince Joe to cheat on his wife, Bonnie. Joe was supposed to be one of his closest friends. The early Peter might have accidentally stumbled into a situation that created romantic complications, but he would not have purposefully tried to sabotage his friend's marriage. Joe Swanson's character arc across the series is one of the more quietly sad stories in the show's background. He was introduced in Season 1 as the cool new neighbor, the wheelchair-bound police officer who was tough and respected and admired by everyone. Peter was actually jealous of Joe's popularity. By the later seasons, Joe was reduced to a figure of mockery, his disability having shifted from a character trait into a punchline. His friends mocked him. His wife fell out of love with him. The man that Peter once envied was now a man that Peter regularly humiliated. That inversion from admiration to cruelty tracks exactly the inversion of Peter's own character. The show made occasional attempts to course correct with Peter, episodes that acknowledged the problem and tried to address it. The episode Peter's Sister revealed that Peter's own older sister had abused him physically and emotionally when they were children. That the cruelty he directed outward was in some way the cruelty he had absorbed inward being discharged. This was genuine storytelling. It gave Peter's behavior context and dimension without excusing it. It suggested that somewhere under the aggression was someone who had been hurt and did not know how to carry the hurt without passing it on. And then the following episode reset everything. The insight was discarded. The cruelty continued as before. This is the specific quality of the later show's relationship with its own darkness. It could see the problem. It could articulate the problem. It was capable of the kind of storytelling that would begin to address the problem. And then it would put the problem back in the drawer and close it and carry on as if the articulation had been the repair rather than just the diagnosis. Peter Griffin went from the lovable fool who made you laugh at yourself to the cruel fool who made you uncomfortable in your own chair. And the distance between those two things is the distance between a show that was doing something meaningful and a show that had replaced meaning with spectacle. Section 7, the cutaway gags that went way too far. Before we talk about the specific cutaway gags that crossed into truly dark territory, it is worth spending a moment appreciating how genuinely brilliant the best cutaways were, because understanding the heights makes the descent more interesting. The cutaway gag is the show's most recognized formal device, and in the early seasons it functioned with an elegance that is easy to underestimate. The structure was simple. A character makes a reference. Something reminds them of something else. The screen cuts to a visual representation of that something else. The joke lands. The screen cuts back. Simple in structure, infinitely variable in execution. The best early cutaways worked because they were specific. They were not random. The joke that landed in a 20-second visual gag landed because the specific nature of the reference was funny, because the incongruity was precise rather than general, because someone sat down and wrote a specific joke for this specific moment. There's a difference between a cutaway where a character says something like, "This is worse than the time I was at a restaurant with a bad waiter," and then the show cuts to a 20-second bit where the bad waiter is, in fact, a shark, and the shark is doing something unexpected. And a cutaway where a character says the same setup, and the show cuts to something that could have been placed after any setup line in any episode and still technically functioned. The early cutaways were of the first type. The later cutaways drifted toward the second type with increasing frequency, until some episodes felt less like stories and more like collections of interchangeable 20-second pieces. But within the later seasons, within the era when the cutaway had become a crutch rather than a tool, there were some specific examples that achieved a different kind of notoriety. Not because they were lazy, but because they were specifically, deliberately, and sometimes shockingly dark in ways that pushed the joke into territory that even Family Guy's audience found uncomfortable. The Boston Marathon cutaway in the episode Turban Cowboy, which aired in March of 2013, is the most notorious example in the show's history, and for reasons that have nothing to do with the content of the joke itself. The cutaway showed Peter Griffin driving a car through the Boston Marathon and running over multiple runners, reaching the finish line after killing everyone in his path. The joke was about Peter cheating at things, about his complete moral indifference to collateral damage. In the abstract, it was dark, but not unprecedented for the show. Then, on April 15th, 2013, roughly 1 month after the episode aired, the Boston Marathon was bombed. 2 pressure cooker bombs exploded near the finish line of the actual race, killing 3 people and injuring over 260 others. The visual similarity between the show's comic depiction and the real event was impossible to ignore. Fox pulled the episode from all platforms and television schedules. Seth MacFarlane publicly expressed regret about the content. The episode was kept off streaming services until 2022, nearly a decade after it aired. The Boston Marathon situation represents a specific category of going too far that is not about intent, but about consequence. The writers did not predict the bombing, no one could have. But the episode became a permanent and uncomfortable reminder of the specific kind of dark humor that makes predictions about real-world violence funny, until real-world violence makes those predictions happen. The Road to the North Pole Christmas special contains what many fans consider the single most disturbing sequence the show ever aired that was not subject to censorship or controversy. In the episode, Brian and Stewie have decided to deliver presents in Santa's place while Santa is too exhausted and ill to work. Their first stop does not go well. What follows is a sequence of graphic violence against a family, including a father attacked with a baseball bat, a mother attacked when she discovers the father's body, and their daughter bound with duct tape. The episode strongly implies, without quite showing it, that the family did not survive the visit. It is played as dark comedy, but the specific details of the violence, the specificity of the victims, the fact that children were involved, pushed it into a register that many viewers found genuinely disturbing rather than funny. The Conway Twitty gags deserve their own extended treatment because they represent a different species of going too far. Not dark in content, but extreme in form. Beginning with the season 7 episode Bill and Peter's Bogus Journey, the show started cutting away from the story to play unedited footage of country music singer Conway Twitty performing one of his songs. Not a clip, not a reference. A full, uninterrupted musical performance, complete from beginning to end, sometimes running close to 3 minutes while the main story waited. Conway Twitty, it should be noted, was a genuine legend of country music. He scored 55 #1 singles on the country charts, a record that stood for decades. He died in 1993. He had nothing whatsoever to do with the Griffin family, or the state of Rhode Island, or the plot of any episode in which his footage appeared. The joke, such as it was, started with a kind of anarchic energy. The first time a Conway Twitty song played for 2 uninterrupted minutes in the middle of an episode, it was genuinely surprising. It was the show doing something so strange and commitment intensive that the sheer audacity of it produced a reaction that could generously be called laughter. By the third and fourth appearances, the audacity had converted entirely to tedium. Seth MacFarlane himself has acknowledged that he was not in the room when the writers first decided to run with the Conway Twitty bit, and explained that they chose Twitty specifically because he found him to be a performer with limited charisma, which seems like a particularly unkind legacy for a man who sold millions of records. The Conway Twitty gag became something specific in the culture of Family Guy criticism. It became the symbol for the show's willingness to consume viewing time without filling it with anything. It was the show saying directly to its audience, "We do not have a joke for this moment. So here's a country song from a man who died 20 years before this episode was written. Please wait." In the episode 3, Acts of God, the show had God himself tell Peter that Conway Twitty wanted the writers to stop using him. The show was aware of how tired the gag had become. It made a joke about being tired of the gag. And then it kept doing the gag anyway. Beyond the Conway Twitty situation, the later seasons contained numerous cutaways that pushed into graphic violence, disturbing medical imagery, and sexual content in ways that moved past provocation into something more like aggressive confrontation. The show started treating the audience not as people to be surprised, but as people to be endured. Can you sit through this? Can you hold your reaction? The question changed from what makes this funny to how long will you keep watching before you look away. The season 15 episode Hot Shots contained a cutaway where Peter, dressed as the Joker, walked away from a hospital that he had just caused to explode in a Joker-inspired act of destruction, with implications that the explosion was massive enough to kill an unknown number of people. The same episode made a reference to the death of Heath Ledger that collapsed the distance between the parody and the real loss of a human life in a way that felt careless rather than dark. The most technically sophisticated cutaways were always the ones where the joke was doing genuine work, where the visual gag was saying something about the characters or the situation or the world that the main story could not say as efficiently. The worst cutaways of the later seasons were the ones where the gag was doing nothing at all except being extreme enough to produce a reaction, where the shock was mistaken for substance. Section 8. Glenn Quagmire. The show's permission structure. Walking on two legs. Glenn Quagmire is one of the most philosophically interesting characters in Family Guy's catalog because his existence in the show raises a question that the show itself never quite answered cleanly. What is the difference between a character whose bad behavior is acknowledged and criticized and a character whose bad behavior is celebrated? Quagmire is a sexual predator. That is the explicit nature of the character. He is a man who pursues women through manipulation, who has no boundaries around consent, who treats women as objects for his use, and whose character description from the official show materials includes the information that he is supposedly in his 70s, despite looking decades younger. His immediate neighbors know exactly what he is and have never once meaningfully confronted it. Joe Swanson, a police officer, has watched Quagmire do things that should require an arrest and has done nothing. The show's world has built walls around Quagmire that allow him to exist without consequence. It is impossible to discuss the show's permission structure around transgressive characters without also discussing Herbert. Herbert the Pervert, introduced in the season 3 episode To Live and Die in Dixie, and voiced by Mike Henry, is a 92-year-old man with an explicit, unmistakable, and never confronted attraction to Chris Griffin, the show's teenage son. He delivers his lines in a slow, whistling, thin-voiced drawl that has become one of the show's most iconic sound signatures. He lures children with an ice cream truck. He asks them to come inside his house. He makes comments so explicitly inappropriate that a room full of actual adults would call the police. Nobody ever calls the police. Peter and Lois are aware that Herbert exists and does the things he does. Joe Swanson, the police officer who lives next door, has witnessed Herbert in action. In one episode, Herbert saves Chris from a fire, and the rescue is presented in a way that makes clear something terrible happened in the aftermath, with the entire neighborhood watching and doing nothing. Joe is among the witnesses. Joe does nothing. Herbert became a fan favorite despite, or perhaps because of, the extreme discomfort of the character's premise. Mike Henry's voice work gave him a quality that was genuinely funny in a queasy way. The delivery was so specific and so committed that the character transcended simple offense and landed somewhere more complicated, the way very good comedy about very dark things sometimes does. But that landing is not consistent and not reliable, and the character's ongoing presence across series of episodes represents exactly the kind of sustained normalization that critics of the show have most consistently pointed toward. Mike Henry has acknowledged that Herbert was not created with deliberate intent. He improvised the original Herbert lines. Seth MacFarlane laughed. The laugh was enough to keep it in. The character that was born from that improvised moment became one of the show's most recognized recurring faces, which says something specific about how creative decisions in a writer's room can compound over years into something much larger than the original moment that produced them. The show eventually, in its later seasons, largely retired Herbert. The character appeared less frequently. The most extreme versions of his material were pulled back. Whether this was a deliberate creative choice or simply a reflection of broader cultural shifts in what was acceptable to put on screen as comedy, the effect was the same. Herbert faded. The character who had been part of the show's identity for 20 years became a rarer presence, appearing occasionally for nostalgic effect without the sustained campaign of inappropriate behavior that had defined the character's early seasons. But the history is there, the decades of episodes are there, and the question of what the show was doing when it sustained that character across all of those years, what it thought it was saying, and what it was actually saying is one that does not have a comfortable answer. In the early seasons, there was an argument to be made that Quagmire served a satirical function. The joke was not celebrating what he did, but exposing the gap between how he saw himself and what he actually was. He was the guy who thought of himself as a charming lover and was actually a horror. The laugh was uncomfortable, which was the point. The discomfort was the commentary. As the seasons went on, that interpretive space closed. The discomfort stopped being framed as critique and started being framed as entertainment. Quagmire's behavior became a source of triumph rather than exposure. The audience was invited to enjoy the antics rather than wince at them. His catchphrases became cultural shorthand, deployed without irony in places far removed from the show. The episode screams of silence. The story of Brenda Q is often cited as one of the most uncomfortable and misguided episodes the show ever produced. And it is worth understanding why, because it illuminates exactly how the show's relationship with difficult subjects went wrong in ways that were specific rather than accidental. In this episode, Quagmire is trying to protect his sister Brenda from an abusive boyfriend named Jeff. The subject matter was a genuine departure for the show and was handled with unusual seriousness. The episode did not lean into the show's typical comedic register when depicting Jeff's abuse of Brenda. The violence was relatively realistic. The psychological dynamics of the abuse were drawn with care. The episode was, in stretches, genuinely disturbing to watch in a way that felt intentional and pointed rather than gratuitous. The problem was the messenger, the character the show had chosen to be the Moral center of this domestic violence storyline was Glenn Quagmire, a man whose entire character history on the show had been a catalog of exactly the kind of predatory behavior the episode was ostensibly condemning. Having Quagmire deliver the episode's moral weight about abuse and consent required the audience to either forget who Quagmire was or accept a level of hypocrisy so complete that it undermined the serious content the episode was trying to generate. Critics widely pointed out this contradiction. The episode received significant negative attention not because people did not want the show to address domestic violence, but because the show's choice of spokesperson made the address feel hollow. How seriously can we take an episode about the wrongness of predatory behavior toward women when the character delivering that message is one of the most celebrated predators in the show's cast? Quagmire's relationship with the Simpsons family, in a deleted scene that was eventually restored on DVD, showed the character assaulting Marge Simpson off-screen, and then the scene played it as a punchline. Fox pulled the scene from the original broadcast and told the producers of both shows that they could not use characters from each other's shows as targets going forward. The restored scene is genuinely difficult to watch because it occupies the specific space between parody and endorsement without cleanly landing on either side. There is something important to note about Quagmire as a show-length character choice. The show committed to him. It kept him. It never genuinely confronted what it was doing by featuring a character whose behavior was this specific and this extreme without the kind of reckoning that would have made the character mean something beyond the laugh. He existed in a protected space, shielded from consequences by the show's commitment to keeping its world intact. He was always going to be there next week, having done everything he had done this week, and the week would reset, and the behavior would continue, and the laugh track would cover the space where the reckoning should have been. The show eventually gave Quagmire a father who revealed a secret about their relationship that was meant to complicate Quagmire and give him backstory. It gave him moments of genuine friendship and occasional genuine pain. It tried at intervals to make him three-dimensional, but the core of the character, the sexual predation played for laughs, was never challenged in a way that stuck. In the Season 8 episode where Quagmire delivered his famous speech about Brian, where he laid out everything that made Brian insufferable, the show was clearly aware that its characters had accumulated histories that made them morally difficult. The speech is accurate about Brian. It is also delivered by a man who, by the show's own internal logic, has done far worse than anything Brian has done. Two characters who should not be throwing stones were throwing stones at each other, and the show acknowledged the irony while also leaning on it for entertainment. This is one of the most specific ways Family Guy went too far. Not in a single moment, but in the sustained management of a character whose existence normalized things that should not have been normalized. The individual joke might land. The cumulative weight of 15 seasons of the same character doing the same things without consequence is a different kind of going too far, quieter and more persistent, and in some ways harder to address. Section 9. The episodes that got banned and the ones that maybe should have. The formal history of Family Guy's relationship with censorship and broadcast bans is actually shorter than many people assume. Despite the show's long career of pushing against the edges of what network television would permit, there is technically only one episode that was officially banned from airing in the United States. That episode is Partial Terms of Endearment, which was produced for the 8th season and which Fox announced before the season even aired that they would not be broadcasting domestically. The announcement was made at San Diego Comic-Con in 2009. The episode's premise was that Lois becomes a surrogate mother for a college friend and her husband. When the friend and husband die in a car accident, Lois and Peter are left with a decision about whether to continue or terminate the pregnancy. The episode treated this subject with Family Guy's Typical irreverence, ultimately landing somewhere that was funny rather than polemical, with a final joke that acknowledged the metafictional nature of the whole scenario. Fox decided this was too sensitive for American television. BBC Three in the United Kingdom broadcast it on June 20th, 2010, in a primetime slot, and it received over 1 million viewers and largely positive responses. It was released on the American DVD box set, meaning Americans who wanted to see it had always been able to. It was simply never given a domestic broadcast. The episode's formal ban status is interesting partly because of what it says about the show's relationship with broadcast standards. Family Guy had produced episodes with graphic violence, episodes that made jokes about suicide, episodes that depicted sexual situations in considerable detail, and none of these were banned. The abortion episode was banned not because of violence or graphic content, but because it touched a specific political subject with direct relevance to ongoing national debate. The ban was not about the quality or the extremity of the content. It was about the subject matter landing in a particular place in American culture. The episode that had perhaps the most significant real-world impact was Turban Cowboy, which we discussed in the cutaway section. Its removal from all broadcast and streaming platforms following the Boston Marathon bombing represents the show's single most consequential brush with the way comedy and reality can collide. The episode was not banned in the formal sense, but was withdrawn voluntarily out of sensitivity to the real event, which is a more meaningful form of self-censorship. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was technically produced as a Season 3 episode, but was not broadcast on Fox until 2004, 3 years after it was produced, because of concerns about its content involving a song that parodied anti-Semitic stereotypes, with a level of specificity that made the network nervous. The episode was eventually broadcast with some modifications and has since been freely available, but the 3-year delay remains the longest gap between production and broadcast for any non-banned episode the show produced. The Venezuelan government's reaction to the season 7 episode 420, in which Brian leads a campaign to legalize marijuana, resulted in cable networks in Venezuela being warned they would face fines for continuing to broadcast the show. Venezuela's justice minister specifically cited the episode as an example of American content promoting drug use. This was the first time a foreign government had taken formal regulatory action against Family Guy, and it represented an escalation in the show's international footprint that the writers had not necessarily anticipated. There are episodes that many fans argue should have been withdrawn or reconsidered, but were not. The episode screams of silence-occupied critics and advocacy groups for domestic violence who felt that its depiction of abuse, while more realistic than the show's usual register, framed the subject matter in ways that were counterproductive. Several mental health organizations noted that the episode's conclusion, in which the abusive partner was removed permanently, bypassed the actual psychological dynamics of leaving abusive relationships in ways that created a false picture of how such situations typically unfold. The episode Brian and Stewie, which we will discuss at length in the next section, contains a sustained treatment of suicidal ideation that was serious enough to prompt the Parents Television Council to file a complaint with the FCC. The PTC specifically cited the scenes in which Brian discussed his reasons for keeping a gun and contemplated what it would feel like to use it. The FCC investigated and did not find the episode in violation of broadcast standards, but the complaint itself highlighted how unusual the episode was in its willingness to engage with genuine mental health content in a format that did not typically allow for such engagement. What the formal censorship history of Family Guy reveals is less about the show's darkness than about how broadcasters and regulators define harm. Violence, even graphic violence, has generally been permitted. Sexual content in various forms has been negotiated case by case. The two subjects that have triggered the most significant formal responses are political subjects with direct cultural sensitivity, the abortion episode, the anti-Semitism concerns around the Weinstein episode, and real-world tragedies that cast retrospective shadows on fictional content, the Boston Marathon situation. The rest, the accumulated body of dark jokes and uncomfortable gags and characters whose behavior never faced consequences, was permitted because it did not trigger the specific regulatory tripwires that network television had established. Whether that permissibility was appropriate or not is a more complicated question than a formal ban history can answer. Section 10. The Conway-Twitty Plateau and Other Heights of Beautiful Laziness. There's a specific flavor of creative decision that is so committed to its own wrongness that it loops around and becomes interesting again. Not funny exactly, but fascinating in the way that only truly confident, terrible ideas can be fascinating. The Conway-Twitty gag is the most famous example, but the show's later seasons were scattered with moments that fell into this category. The Cutaway Land episode, which was designed as a celebration and exploration of the show's most iconic formal device, and which ended up being a demonstration of everything critics had been saying was wrong with that device. The episode featured Peter and Lois discovering that they could travel physically between cutaway gags, entering the fictional worlds of the show's most memorable jokes. Structurally, this was a brilliant idea. It was the show fully embracing its own absurdist logic and using it as a story engine. The execution undermined the concept in a specific way. The episode used recycled cutaways from earlier seasons, replaying old jokes rather than generating new ones, which transformed what should have been a love letter to the show's most distinctive quality into an unintentional demonstration that the well had run dry. You cannot celebrate your creativity by retreating to your old creativity. And the episode ended with Peter waking up and realizing it had all been a dream, which is the oldest and most resigned possible ending for any story. The episode that was meant to be the ultimate tribute to Family Guy's signature device ended with the writers shrugging. The episode Back to the Pilot from Season 10, in which Brian and Stewie traveled back in time to the very first episode of the show, contained a moment that managed to simultaneously be funny and devastating. While visiting the pilot, they observed the characters standing around awkwardly during a cutaway gag, waiting in silence for it to end so the story could continue. The joke acknowledged that the characters had nothing to do during these interruptions. They just stood there, present in their own story, waiting for it to be relevant to them again. The joke landed, and then it raised a question that it did not attempt to answer. If the characters themselves found the cutaways an imposition on their story, if the most meta and self-aware version of the show was willing to depict the cutaways as something the characters endured rather than participated in, what did that say about the show's relationship with its own formal identity? The You Have AIDS musical number from Season 3 is a genuinely excellent example of dark comedy, done precisely right, which is worth including here because it provides contrast. Peter performs a barbershop quartet number informing a man he has just received a diagnosis, the singers harmonizing on the specific word AIDS while the man's face collapses. The joke works because the incongruity is not arbitrary. The cheerful musical format and the devastating content are placed in collision with purpose. The horror of the content is highlighted, not obscured, by the inappropriateness of the presentation. It is comedy that makes you laugh at the gap between how we perform happiness and how bad things actually are. The episode that was designed to address the show's own excess in the most direct way was probably the season 13 crossover with The Simpsons, called The Simpsons Guy. The episode was notable for the extended fight sequence it contained between Peter Griffin and Homer Simpson, a brawl that was clearly modeled on the chicken fights, but which featured the two most famous animated fathers on American television destroying each other and the town of Springfield in the process. The fight was spectacular in the mechanical sense, technically accomplished, clearly made with genuine effort and affection for both properties. It also contained a moment, buried in the middle of the fight, that served as an unintentional thesis statement for the entire show's later period. Comic Book Guy appeared on screen and delivered his signature line from The Simpsons, declaring what he was witnessing the worst chicken fight ever. The meta-commentary was legible even to casual viewers. The show was critiquing itself. The show was saying, we know this is a lesser version of the thing. We have done better before. The show said that, and then it kept going. The tendency toward meta-commentary about the show's own declining quality is one of the most specific features of the later seasons. Characters would break the fourth wall and reference the fact that the show had been running too long. Peter would acknowledge directly to the camera that the episode was not as good as older episodes. The writers would use the characters to make jokes about the writing. This was treated as a form of self-awareness, a demonstration that the show knew what it was doing. But self-awareness is not the same as change. A person can be completely aware that they are doing something counterproductive and continue doing it anyway. The comedy of self-awareness only lands when it is paired with at least the implication of possible course correction. When a show has been self-awarely describing its own problems for 10 seasons while continuing to embody those problems, the self-awareness stops functioning as comedy and starts functioning as something more like a confession. The show was saying, we know, over and over and over. We know. And the audience, which had mostly already made its peace with what the show had become, listened to the confession and waited to see if it would be followed by action. It was usually not followed by action. To understand what the Conway Twitty gag meant in its full context, it helps to sit with what Conway Twitty himself represented within the show's specific cultural imagination. The writers were not choosing any random artist. They were choosing someone whose aesthetic, whose presentation, whose specific era was calculated to be the exact opposite of what a Family Guy audience in 2007 or 2009 expected to find in the middle of an episode. Twitty was old. He was country. He was smooth and slow and deeply, genuinely earnest in his performance in a way that was the complete antithesis of the show's usual register of irony and velocity. When the show cut to Conway Twitty singing one of his genuine hits in the middle of an episode, it was doing something that had the surface structure of anti-comedy. Anti-comedy is the genre where the absence of a joke becomes the joke, where the violation of the viewer's expectation of comedy is itself the comedic event. Anti-comedy requires commitment and specific timing. It works when the gap between what the audience expects and what they receive is precisely calibrated. The first Conway Twitty appearance worked as anti-comedy. It was perfectly timed, completely unexpected, and the gap between the show's established velocity and the sudden, patient, 2-minute country performance created a reaction that you could reasonably call laughter. The second appearance worked less well. The third was padding. By the fourth, the show had recycled the bit so many times that the anti-comedy had become simply comedy that was not there, a space where nothing was happening and the clock was running. McFarlane's admission that he was not present when the writers decided to run with the Twitty gag, and that their specific choice of Twitty was because he found him to be a performer of limited stage presence, is one of the more revealing windows into how creative decisions in a writer's room can escape the gravity of the original intent that generated them. The bit was born from one person's reaction to a specific performer's specific quality. It was kept alive by institutional momentum, by the show's tendency to revisit successful bits long past the point of success, and by the straightforward fact that a 2-minute Conway Twitty performance took the same amount of screen time as 2 minutes of actual writing without requiring any writing. In the episode 3 Acts of God, God himself told Peter that Conway Twitty had asked the writers to stop. This is the show doing something it did regularly in the later period, acknowledging a problem through a meta joke while continuing to embody the problem. God's request on Conway Twitty's behalf was funny. It was also a precise description of a real creative failure being packaged as a bit, which is the conversion that the show had perfected over many seasons. Turn the problem into the content. Acknowledge the failure as the humor. Keep going. The audience that was still watching by the time of the third and fourth Conway Twitty appearances was an audience that had already accepted a different contract with the show than the original viewers had. The early audience expected the show to earn every minute of its running time with jokes, stories, or genuine character interaction. The later audience had recalibrated their expectations to include minutes of the show simply not doing very much. The Conway Twitty gag is the most visible symbol of that recalibration because it was the most unapologetic about what it was doing. Other forms of padding at least pretended to be something. Conway Twitty just was what it was. A song playing, the seconds passing, nothing happening, and everyone on both sides of the screen aware of the arrangement. Section 11. The gut punches, dark emotional moments that actually earned their weight. This section is different from the others because we are leaving behind the jokes that went too far through darkness or cruelty or laziness, and moving to something rarer and in some ways more important. The moments where the show went somewhere genuinely heavy and earned the emotional weight it was asking the audience to carry. Family Guy was not primarily an emotional show. Its tools were comedy, provocation, and the sustained maintenance of a specific tone that was irreverent about almost everything. This tone made genuine emotional moments more difficult to produce because the audience had calibrated their expectations around comedy and were not prepared to be moved. But it also made those moments more powerful when they landed, because the contrast between the show's usual register and genuine feeling was itself a form of dramatic impact. The episode Brian and Stewie, the 18th episode of the 8th season and the show's 150th episode overall, is the most complete example of the show doing this right. Brian and Stewie had gone to a local bank so Brian could access his safety deposit box. The vault door closed and locked automatically at the end of the business day, trapping them inside for the weekend. What followed was a bottle episode, a genre of television that confines the action to a single location, forcing the characters to engage with each other without the relief of plot or setting changes. The entire 30-minute episode took place in the vault. There were no cutaway gags, there was no B-plot, no other characters appeared. It was just Brian and Stewie in a small, sealed room, increasingly drunk on a bottle of Glenfiddich Brian had stored in the box. The first half of the episode was broadly comedic, involving a soiled diaper, a desperate phone call wasted on trying to return a $3,000 sweater, and a drunken ear piercing that went predictably badly. These jokes were well executed, and they served an important structural function. They established the tone as familiar before the second half changed it. Then Stewie asked Brian why he had a gun. Brian had a revolver in his safety deposit box. He had been deflecting questions about it. And then, in a moment that producers described as one of the most emotionally challenging scenes the show ever recorded, Brian admitted that he kept the gun in case he ever wanted to commit suicide. He explained that life was sometimes too much, that the scotch in the box was for a last drink, that just knowing there was a way out made things easier to bear. Seth MacFarlane, who voices both Brian and Stewie, was the only person in the recording booth for this episode. He spent the entire 30-minute table read talking to himself, playing both sides of the conversation. Writers who were present have described watching it as one of the most affecting experiences they had in the room. Stewie's response to Brian's confession was not the comedy the show would typically have deployed in such a moment. He listened. He pushed back gently. He told Brian, with honesty that felt earned by everything their friendship had been through, that Brian was his only real friend. That without Brian, Stewie would be lost. That Brian gave his life something it needed. He asked Brian to read to him. Brian agreed. The vault opened. In the morning, they walked out. The episode was praised by critics as one of the best in the show's history. TV critics who had been skeptical of the show's direction for years found that this single episode demonstrated what the show was capable of when it committed to genuine character exploration without the safety net of comedy to catch the fall. An Entertainment Weekly review called it dramatic and unexpected. An MTV critic wrote that beneath the more disturbing elements, there was thoughtful, mature discussion of suicide and what love means. The Parents Television Council filed a complaint with the FCC, which ultimately did not find the episode in violation of standards. The episode was notable for being the only one in the entire run of the series without a single cutaway gag or a single musical number. Not one. The entire show's length rested entirely on two characters talking to each other in a room. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It proved that the show had never needed the cutaways to be compelling. It had always needed character and honesty and the willingness to go somewhere uncomfortable and stay there. The death of Brian Griffin, whatever you think about its handling and reversal, generated genuine feeling that was difficult to dismiss even in retrospect. When Brian was hit by the car in Life of Brian, the absence of comedy was jarring. The show did not make a joke about it, the family grieved without irony. Stewie broke down in a way that felt real. The 100,000 signatures on the Change.org petition within 72 hours, the trending hashtags, the memorial tattoos, the national news coverage, all of it reflected something real. People had an emotional attachment to a cartoon dog that was not contingent on whether that dog had been written well recently. They loved who Brian was. They mourned losing him. The Christmas Guy, 2 episodes later, in which Stewie went back in time to save Brian, was received by many fans as the most purely emotional episode the show had produced in years. The moment when Stewie found past Stewie at the mall and persuaded him to give up his time machine, the selflessness of the sacrifice and the desperation behind it captured something about the Stewie and Brian friendship that all the road to episodes and adventure plots had been pointing toward but never quite reached. Stewie was willing to strand himself in the past to give up everything to have his friend back. That is not a joke. That is love. And Family Guy, the show that built its reputation on being too irreverent for love, had found a way to express it that hit harder than it had any right to. The episode Brian and Stewie, and moments like it scattered through the later seasons, are evidence of something important. The show did not simply lose its capacity for genuine feeling when it lost its golden era. The capacity remained. It was accessible. The writers could find it when they were willing to look. The tragedy is not that the show became incapable of producing meaningful moments. The tragedy is that the meaningful moments became exceptions rather than the baseline, islands of genuine craft in a sea of content that had stopped trying quite as hard. There are other emotional gut punches scattered through the show's history that deserve recognition alongside the bank vault episode and Brian's death. The road trip episodes between Brian and Stewie, particularly Road to the North Pole and Road to Germany, produced moments that balanced comedy and genuine feeling in the proportions the early show had used so effectively. These were not the same as the bank vault episode, which was formally stripped of everything that was not character and honesty. But they had warmth that was real, not performed. The kind of warmth that accrues between characters who have shared enough genuine experience that their affection for each other is legible without announcement. The episode Road to Germany, which sent Brian and Stewie back to World War II, contained a sequence that was played entirely straight with no ironic distance, in which they witnessed the Holocaust. The show did not make a joke about it. It let the horror be what it was. This was a choice that required confidence. The confidence to trust that the audience could hold the darkness without needing the show to diffuse it with comedy. The episode was controversial in some quarters for using the setting as an adventure backdrop, but the specific moment of genuine historical weight was handled with more care than might have been expected from a show that had recently been using a country singer as a time-filling device. The season 5 episode Stewie Loves Lois, which opened the 5th season, took the shift in Stewie's character and used it for something genuinely moving. The episode explored the relationship between Stewie and his mother from a new angle, showing that underneath the elaborate murder plots and the grandiose speeches about destroying her, Stewie was also capable of something that looked very much like a child's straightforward love for a parent. The moment where Stewie, having spent seasons plotting against Lois, simply enjoyed being held by her, was quiet and well-observed and true. There was an episode in the later seasons where Stewie built a time machine specifically to go back and spend the day with the Brian of earlier seasons, the Brian who was smarter and warmer and less compromised. The episode was explicitly about grief for who Brian used to be. The joke had layers that the show did not always manage. It was sad and funny at the same time, which is the specific combination that the best of Family Guy always hit, and that the worst of it could never quite locate. These moments do not redeem the show's worst choices. They do not retroactively make the Meg years okay, or render Brian's decline less painful, or restore what was lost when Stewie stopped being dangerous. But they prove something that is worth knowing, which is that the people who made Family Guy never lost the ability to make Family Guy. They just did not always choose to. When the show was good in its later years, it was genuinely good. It was the kind of good that reminded you why you had ever cared in the first place. And that is, in its own way, the darkest joke the show ever told. Not because of anything violent or offensive or controversial, but because the show looked at what it was capable of and chose, over and over, to only be that thing sometimes. Section 12. The Wind Down, a warm, strange ride to the end. Here we are. The house is quiet now, or mostly quiet, or as quiet as houses ever get when the world outside is still doing its thing. Take a breath with me right here. Slow breath in and out. The shoulders drop. The jaw unclenches. You have earned this. You have made it through the whole thing. You have spent some time in the Griffin house tonight. You have been in the booth at the Drunken Clam, with the dim lighting and the worn-out stools, and the 4 friends who drove each other mad and needed each other anyway. You have sat in Stewie's room while he built something that should not exist. You have watched Peter and a giant chicken fall through the ceiling of a restaurant, and you have felt, despite everything, a kind of genuine warmth about it. Family Guy is a complicated piece of television history. It is a show that should have been canceled, and was canceled twice, and came back anyway because people loved it too much to let it stay gone. It is a show that produced some of the most genuinely creative and emotionally resonant television of its era, and also some of the laziest, cruelest, and most uncomfortable. It is a show that understood its characters well enough to destroy them, and did so anyway, season by season, choice by choice. The moments we have walked through tonight exist on a spectrum that is wider than most shows allow themselves to occupy. On one end, you have the chicken fights, the purest expression of the show's capacity for joyful excess, animation and comedy and commitment working in perfect harmony to produce something that was entirely, perfectly itself. On the other end, you have the Meg Griffin story across 10 years, which was the show's willingness to take excess in a direction that was not joyful, that was not harmless, that left a mark on everyone who watched it, including the woman who gave the character her voice. In between those two poles, you have everything else. Brian losing himself over many seasons and occasionally being found again. Stewie giving up his villainy and gaining something real and warm in its place, even if what he gained was less singular than what he gave up. Peter going from lovable to alarming, and the show never quite deciding which version it preferred. The cutaway gag going from the show's greatest gift to its most reliable crutch, and back again to something the show eventually made a joke about before continuing to use it anyway. There's something worth saying about the experience of watching a show for 25 years. Most television shows do not last that long. Most creative works of any kind do not sustain themselves across 25 years of production. The shows that do last that long change. They have to. The world changes around them. The people making them change. The culture they exist in changes. A show that stayed exactly the same across 25 years would be a different kind of failure. The failure of the thing that refused to grow and therefore calcified. Family Guy changed. Sometimes the change was growth, genuine creative development that produced things the original show could not have. Sometimes the change was drift, the loss of something specific and irreplaceable replaced by something generic and reliable. The history of the show is the history of trying to tell those two kinds of change apart, which is often harder than it looks because they can look the same from the outside. The jokes that went too far are, in the final accounting, evidence of ambition. Bad ambition in some cases, misdirected ambition in others, and occasionally very good ambition that produced something genuinely worth carrying around with you. The show that never tried to go too far would have been safer and smaller and considerably less interesting than the show that existed, with all its faults and all its moments of horrible beauty. The ban on the abortion episode says something about cultural politics that has nothing to do with the show. The Boston Marathon coincidence says something about the specific relationship between dark comedy and real disaster that the show could not have predicted. The Meg situation says something about creative choices that compound over time in ways that the individual episode cannot see. The chicken fights say something about craft and commitment and the value of doing one absurd thing with complete technical excellence. All of these things are true at the same time. The show was great and the show was terrible. The show meant something and the show lost track of what it meant. The show was funny and the show was not always funny. The show loved its characters and the show was cruel to its characters. These things coexist. They have to in something that has been going this long, and it is still going. Renewed through season 27, locked in through the 2028 to 2029 television season, which will put it 30 years old and still airing on a Wednesday night. That is an extraordinary thing. It is not evidence of ongoing quality in the narrow sense of the word. It is evidence of something more interesting, which is that the relationship between the show and the people who watch it has survived everything. The disappointments and the resurrections, the moments of genuine darkness and the moments of surprising warmth, the characters who became unrecognizable and the episodes that reminded you why you cared. Peter Griffin will still be causing harm. Stewie will still have occasional flashes of the brilliant monster he used to be. Brian will still be pretending to write and occasionally meaning it. Meg will be okay, mostly for the first time in a long time. The chicken fights were glorious. The Meg situation was genuinely sad. Brian's arc was a loss. Stewie's arc was a trade. The bank vault episode was a masterpiece. The Conway Twitty gag was either the funniest joke about comedy's relationship with time or the most honest accidental advertisement for writing something instead of nothing, depending on the night. There's one final thing worth saying before we close, and it comes back to the bank vault. To Brian in the dark, drunk on scotch, confessing to a baby that he keeps a gun in a safe deposit box because sometimes life is too much. To Stewie's response, which was not a joke, which was not a cutaway, which was just a small being telling his only real friend that he needed him to stay. The show did that. In the middle of everything else it did, all the excess and the cruelty and the laziness and the brilliance, it did that. It went to a place that dark and real and came back with something worth feeling. That is not nothing. That is the whole argument for why we keep watching. Because you never know when the next bank vault moment is coming, when the show will suddenly remember everything it knows and give you something you were not prepared for. One of the things you find when you spend as much time with a show as we have tonight is that your relationship with it changes. You stop seeing it as just a collection of jokes, or just a declining institution, or just a corporate product that exists because the numbers still justify the budget. You start seeing it the way you see people you have known for a long time, with full awareness of the things they have done wrong and full awareness of the things they have done beautifully, and the complicated truth that both of those things belong to the same person, the same show. Family Guy is flawed in ways that are sometimes genuinely harmful. It is also capable of genuine art. Those two things live in the same building on Spooner Street, and they have always lived there, and the show will carry both of them forward into whatever seasons remain. Somebody always keeps watching. Somebody always comes back. Somebody is right now, at some hour in some part of the world, watching an old episode of Family Guy and feeling exactly what they felt the first time they saw it, including you, tonight, right now, wherever you are. Thank you for being here. Thank you for spending this time in this ridiculous, beloved, complicated, fictional neighborhood on Spooner Street in the town in Rhode Island, where a baby in a onesie once had plans for global domination, and a talking dog once kept a gun in a safety deposit box, and a giant chicken is still out there somewhere, one eye opening in the dark. If you enjoyed this, leave a like. If you want more of whatever this is, subscribe to Uncle Guy Lore and come back for the next one. And drop a comment telling me your favorite Family Guy moment, the one that still lands for you no matter how many times you have seen it. I read every single comment. Until next time, stay comfortable, stay cozy, and get some rest. This is Uncle Guy Lore. Good night.